Sacred Heart Hospital's fluorescent corridors hum with the antiseptic smell of bleach and the rhythmic beep of monitors keeping time like metronomes counting down lives. Margaret Walsh arrives at 0630 hours, moving through the ICU with steady hands and the invisible efficiency of someone trained to operate in chaos, her barely perceptible limp in her left leg a souvenir from an explosion in Sangin she never discusses with anyone. She wears the same faded blue scrubs every shift, her graying hair pulled back so tight it seems to stretch her composure across her face, speaking only when necessary, asking permission before touching anything, apologizing for observations no one asked her to make. The other nurses ignore her with the kind of practiced indifference reserved for people who've already decided not to matter. At 06 for 5 hours, Margaret reconciles supply records in the medication room, her eyes catching discrepancies with the precision of someone who'd once tracked ammunition counts in a war zone where every bullet mattered. 3 separate surgical kit charges don't match the usage logs. $4,800 in medication marked as delivered but never documented as administered. She photographs 3 pages with her phone, uncertain why her hands move to do it, uncertain why the pattern feels like the beginning of something she should have ignored. She tucks the phone back into her scrub pocket and clears her browser history like she's done something wrong by noticing. The morning shift rolls forward with the grinding momentum of a hospital that doesn't stop, doesn't slow, doesn't care about one nurse who moves through it like a ghost in blue scrubs. By 1,000 hours, Margaret has started for 4s without complaint, changed 6 patient gowns, documented vitals in charts no one will fully read, and held a dying man's hand for 17 minutes while his daughter cried into her shoulder. The man's name was Gerald. Margaret will remember it. The hospital will reassign his bed within an hour of his heart stopping. At 1,340 hours, an alert sounds through the intercom. Trauma Bay 4. Multiple casualties incoming. An IED explosion in the San Diego area has sent 3 patients rolling towards Sacred Heart, and the emergency department shifts into the choreography of controlled urgency that Margaret has seen 10,000 times. Orderlies move past her like they're choreographed. Nurses grab trauma supplies. A respiratory therapist wheels a ventilator toward the bays. The sound of equipment being prepped echoes down the corridor like ammunition being loaded. The gurney arrives at 1,358 hours, and Margaret is already there, already watching, already moving toward the stretcher without being asked because that's what she does, what she's always done. The paralyzed patient is a man in his early 50s with a face carved from granite and a body that no longer responds to the signals his brain is sending. An IED shattered his spine at T4 and T5. His wife Sarah follows 3 steps behind, her eyes the eyes of someone who understands that the man on the stretcher is the same person she married but also completely different, and there's no surgery that fixes that kind of rupture. The jacket falls open as orderlies transfer him from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital bed. Trauma protocol dictates speed, efficiency, minimal movement. Nobody notices the way the fabric shifts. Nobody notices the small detail hidden in the lining like a secret. Margaret notices. Her breath stops. Actually stops, the kind of breath cessation that belongs in a medical chart because it means something shifted in her physiology the way a fuse box trips when something draws too much power. Sewn into the inside of the jacket lining is a faded unit patch. Not regulation. Hidden. Meant to be invisible to everyone except the man wearing it and the people who would recognize what it meant. The same patch. The exact same patch her son David wore under his uniform, under his dress blues, under every regulation garment because it meant something he couldn't speak about but carried anyway. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The unit patch of a man who had survived Helmand Province, who had kept her son alive through 2 deployments that Margaret spent praying in hospital parking lots at 3 in the morning, who had commanded men through terrain that ate soldiers for breakfast and asked for seconds. The patch means this man was leadership. Command level. The kind of responsibility that doesn't sleep. Margaret touches it once. Just once. Her fingertips brush the worn fabric like she's touching a ghost, like she's confirming something she can't explain without revealing everything she's hidden for 47 years. The cloth is rough beneath her calloused hands, the hands of a trauma nurse, the hands that used to do other things in other places where blood meant something different than it means here. She pulls the blanket up to cover it before anyone else sees, before the visible detail becomes evidence, before the patch draws the kind of attention that Margaret Walsh cannot afford. Sarah follows the stretcher, her voice breaking as she asks questions no one answers because they're moving too fast, because trauma bays don't slow down for explanation. Margaret guides her to the family waiting area with a hand on her shoulder, the touch of someone who understands that a wife watching her husband's spine get reassembled is experiencing a kind of catastrophe that has no triage level because it can't be quantified or fixed or made better by any amount of surgical skill. Margaret whispers something she shouldn't whisper, something that violates the distance she's supposed to maintain. "He's going to get the best care possible," she says, and she means it in a way that sounds like a promise, like an oath, like something she just volunteered for without knowing the cost. Dr. Sterling enters trauma bay for at 1,402 hours. He's already shaking his head before he examines the patient, already calculating something behind his eyes that has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the decision he's already made. His face carries the kind of arrogance that comes from 23 years of being right, or being perceived as right, or convincing himself that superiority is the same as righteousness. He glances at the imaging, the shattered vertebrae visible on the CT scan, the neural disruption so complete that this man will spend the rest of his life in a bed or a wheelchair or some version of existence that doesn't include autonomy. Margaret watches from the corner of the bay, where she's supposed to be invisible. Where she's become expert at being invisible. "No," Dr. Sterling says. "Not to anyone specific. Just no." He pulls the chart toward him, scans the vitals with the attention span of someone already making space in his mind for the next patient. "Resource allocation," he says, and his voice carries the weight of a decision that's already been written, already been filed, already been justified in his own architecture of reason. "Better prognoses. We don't have the surgical capacity for complete transaction. Not without compromising care for patients with more favorable outcomes. It's not an examination. It's a dismissal." He walks away without touching the patient, without looking at the X-rays beyond that first glance, without listening to anything his team might offer. The room temperature drops about 15 degrees. Margaret doesn't move. Doesn't speak. Doesn't react in any way that would violate the composure that's keeping her in this hospital instead of in a cell or a facility or the kind of place where people who've seen what she's seen sometimes end up. She watches him walk away like he's just decided to refuse life support to someone wearing her son's unit patch, and that's when the real nightmare begins. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Margaret understood, in that moment, that one man had just decided the fate of a person based on probability calculations and cost analysis, and she had to watch it happen from the corner of a trauma bay in faded blue scrubs that marked her as someone whose opinion didn't exist. She had to stand there. She had to be silent. She had to let it happen. By 14:30 hours, 5 more doctors have been called. 5 more doctors have reviewed the chart. 5 more doctors have walked away from trauma bay for with various iterations of the same response. Resource constraints. Limited surgical capacity. Unfavorable prognosis. The math didn't work. The man on the stretcher, the commander who'd kept her son alive, the man carrying a patch that meant he'd been trusted with other people's lives, the math said he wasn't worth the resource expenditure. 7 doctors. Every single one. The sound of their rejection echoes through the corridor like rounds fired in sequence. Margaret refills the 4 bag in silence. Adjusts the catheter with precision. Documents his vitals in a chart that no one is going to read because a decision has already been made in a language that doesn't include mercy. She moves like water around obstacles, like someone who understands that the only weapon she has left is competence, and she's going to hold on to that weapon until it breaks. Sarah sits in the waiting area with her hands folded in a way that suggests she's been practicing this position for her entire marriage, waiting for things, waiting for news, waiting for men in uniforms to tell her something that changes everything. Margaret brings her water without being asked. Sits with her for 45 seconds without speaking. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is just be present in someone else's catastrophe. At 18:47 hours, Margaret leaves through the employee entrance and walks to her car in the parking lot where the San Diego heat is starting to cool down for the evening. She sits in the driver's seat for 11 minutes without turning the key. She touches the unit patch she's seen, the one she couldn't touch, the one that's going to haunt her decision for whatever comes next. 7 doctors have walked away from a man wearing her son's unit patch. She turns the key. Something in her chest has shifted. The calculus of her survival has changed. The equation that's been keeping her invisible, silent, and alive has just become more complicated than she can solve from a corner trauma bay. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the break room like a blade. "Nurse Walsh. We need to discuss your falsified medication logs." Margaret turned. Sarah Reeves stood by the coffee station, her hand frozen halfway to a mug, eyes already red from crying. Sterling held a printed report, his fingers drumming against it with the rhythm of a man who'd rehearsed this moment. "I've never falsified anything," Margaret said. Her voice came out level. Not defensive. Not angry. Just fact. 3 discrepancies in controlled substances. Sterling's voice rose, performing now, aware that Sarah could hear every word. "You signed for morphine that was never administered. That's a federal violation, Margaret. A criminal violation." Sarah's hand covered her mouth. Margaret took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take in places where panic meant death. Where the sound of your own breathing could give away your position. "Those discrepancies exist, Dr. Sterling. But they're not mine to explain." She held his gaze without blinking. One tear escaped down her left cheek, not from shame, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing exactly what was happening. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. The gesture was so controlled, so deliberate, that it looked like erasure. "Commander Reeves will receive care, Doctor," she said quietly. "Whether you provide it or not." Sterling's face flushed purple. His jaw clenched. He'd expected capitulation. Apology. The break room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electronic hymn. Sarah stared at Margaret with something shifting behind her eyes, recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that the quiet nurse in the corner was made of something harder than bone. Sterling turned and walked out without another word. But his hands were shaking. By 0800 hours, a notice appeared on the unit board in the nurse's station. Printed. Official. Margaret's name circled in red marker like blood on a target. Margaret Walsh. Written warning. Insubordination. Failure to comply with direct physician instruction. Gross disrespect to attending staff. Unsuitable for patient care environment. Dr. Sterling's signature filled the bottom in aggressive black ink. The other nurses saw it before Margaret did. She watched their faces shift, the micro-expressions that happen when people realize the wind has changed direction and they need to choose which way to lean. 5 of them clustered near the board, reading in silence. Their eyes didn't meet hers when she walked past. Not hostile yet. Just careful. At 1200 hours, Margaret sat in the cafeteria with her lunch tray. Turkey sandwich. Applesauce. Black coffee that had been sitting in the warmer since 0600. She picked a table in the middle of the room, the kind of choice that felt safer than corners. For nurses she'd worked alongside for 2 years sat nearby, Chen, Rodriguez, Matthews, and Okafor. They'd shared 12-hour shifts. They'd held each other during code deaths. They'd borrowed coffee money and covered each other's breaks. Margaret sat down. The movement was synchronized. Practiced almost. Chen stood first. Rodriguez followed half a second later. Matthews and Okafor moved as one, their trays collected, their chairs pushed back with the kind of precision that made it clear this wasn't accidental. They migrated to another table across the cafeteria without speaking. Without looking back. No words. No explanation. No betrayal spoken aloud. Just the sound of shoes on tile and the message underneath it, "We cannot afford to be associated with you." Margaret's hands remained perfectly steady around her fork. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She ate her sandwich bite by bite while the silence around her table grew so absolute it became its own presence, a thing with weight and texture, like sitting in a room with the door locked. A younger nurse, Kim, sat down across from her. Brave or foolish, Margaret couldn't decide which. Kim was new. Still had that quality of not yet understanding which way the current flowed. "That's bullshit," Kim said. Just those two words. Simple. True. Margaret looked at her. "It is what it is." "No." Kim leaned forward. "He's lying about you. Everyone knows it." "What everyone knows doesn't matter," Margaret said. "What matters is what we do next." Before Kim could answer, her phone buzzed. She checked it, and Margaret watched the color drain from her face. A text from someone. A warning. A threat. The architecture of fear taking shape in real time. Kim stood up, gathered her tray, and left without another word. Margaret finished her coffee alone. By 14:30 hours, Sterling was in his office with the door closed. Margaret passed by and heard fragments through the gap. "Need that board vote tomorrow. Yes, the Walsh situation, she's a liability. No, she won't be a problem." A pause. Then, "I've already made calls to her references." The old Margaret, the one who'd existed before Sacred Heart, before San Diego, before she decided that invisibility was survival, would have felt her heartbeat accelerate. But the woman who sat in that break room 20 minutes ago had learned a different calculus. Fear was information. Panic was a choice. And she had already made hers. Sterling's voice dropped lower. "The board will vote to terminate. She'll be gone by Friday. No severance. No reference. Nothing." What he didn't know was that there were no references to call. Margaret Walsh the nurse had no previous employment history. Margaret Walsh the civilian didn't exist. The woman who'd come to Sacred Heart 3 years ago had arrived from nowhere and constructed an entire identity from the ground up. School transcripts forged by a friend in the Pentagon's administrative office. Work history built on favor and silence. A social security number that was real but traced to a file marked classified. He could call everyone she'd listed. Every number would ring dead. But that wasn't the part that frightened him yet. That was still coming. At 0230 hours, the alarm screamed. Not the soft chime of a routine alert. The full-throated wail of a code in progress. Margaret's eyes snapped open in the break room where she'd been sitting alone, staring at the disciplinary notice still taped to the unit bulletin board with her name in Sterling's precise handwriting. She was moving before consciousness fully returned, muscle memory older than her nursing license taking command. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like weapons fire reflected off brass. Reeves' room. 3rd ICU bed on the west corridor. She didn't run. Running looked panicked. She walked fast, her rubber-soled shoes whispering against the tile with the exact cadence of someone who'd moved through hostile territory more times than she could count. The monitor's screaming grew louder as she approached, and every instinct that had kept her alive in Sangin, that had kept her son alive, that had brought her to this hospital 3 years ago looking for anonymity, crystallized into pure function. The room exploded into chaos. Not the controlled chaos of a practiced code team. Worse. The chaos of absence. Reeves lay gasping, his massive frame thrashing against the rails. His lips held the pale blue of oxygen starvation. His neck veins were distended like rope, the jugular vein bulging so prominently Margaret could see the individual pulse points from the doorway. The cardiac monitor showed a heart rate of 148, climbing, and the O2 saturation numbers were free-falling, 89, 86, 82. His chest rose and fell in desperate, ineffective movements. The ventilator hissed its rhythmic breath, but something was profoundly wrong with the sound it carried back. The heart tones on the monitor were muffled, distant, as if they were arriving from underwater. Muffled heart sounds. Distended neck veins. Hypoxia. Cardiac tamponade. The code team was in Trauma Bay 2. Margaret heard through the unit intercom, a mass casualty MVA on IR5. No personnel available. No backup. The night nurse, Jennifer, stood frozen at the bedside, her hands trembling as she adjusted the oxygen settings uselessly. The respiratory therapist hadn't answered his page. The resident was 3 minutes out. In 3 minutes, Reeves would be dead. Margaret could calculate it like mathematics. Blood loss into the pericardial sac equals cardiac compression. Compressed heart equals no output. No output equals death. She was already moving into the room before she finished thinking it. Step back, she said to Jennifer, and her voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost the careful deference of the last 72 hours. The tremor in Jennifer's hand stopped the moment Margaret spoke. The sound of authority is a physical thing. It shapes the air around it. Jennifer moved. Margaret's hands were already reaching for the ultrasound cart before she consciously decided to. 23 years. 3 tours. Sangin Valley, where a 6-pound IED took out an entire convoy and she performed a needle decompression on a Marine in the back of a Humvee while rounds pinged off the armor plating and the rotor wash from a Black Hawk shook the vehicle like a dog shaking out water. This was slower. Cleaner. Better lit. She positioned the ultrasound probe against Reeves' chest in the 4th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the screen lit up with the answer. The pericardial sac was a dark halo surrounding the heart silhouette, filled with fluid, blood, compressing the ventricles. The anatomy was textbook. The problem was simple. The solution was surgical, and the only surgeon in the hospital was Sterling, who would let this man die rather than lose face. Muscle memory took over. Margaret set down the ultrasound probe and marked the landmarks from memory, 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, just above the rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. In a combat support hospital in Helmand province while a 6-year-old girl lay on the table with a pneumothorax and her mother keen prayers in Pashto outside the tent. Pain is information. Blood pressure is data. The body tells the story if you listen. Reeves' body was screaming that he was minutes from irreversible shock, and Margaret heard it like music she'd been trained her entire life to play. She opened the code cart with one hand, her fingers finding the 18-gauge angiocath needle without looking. The needle was cool and exact in her palm, the weight of it perfect, familiar. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for permission. She marked the insertion point with her fingertip, feeling the anatomical landmarks through Reeves' skin, the rib, the space, the exact vector where the needle would enter the pericardial sac without perforating the heart. The fluorescent lights hummed their static song above her. The insertion was a single smooth motion. The needle glided through skin, through the thin fascia of the pericardium, and Margaret felt the distinct give of the membrane rupturing, a tactile sensation like breaking through paper. She advanced the catheter over the needle and withdrew the metal stylet, and the syringe at the hub began filling immediately with dark blood. Not bright arterial red. Not venous blue. The purple-black of old blood, stagnant blood, blood that had been compressing a man's heart for hours while 7 doctors walked away. The plunger withdrew smoothly. 30 ccs. 40. 50. Reeves' body responded before the monitor did. His gasping eased. His thrashing stilled. His color shifted from grey-blue toward actual flesh tone, like someone had turned up the saturation on a faded photograph. The O2 sat climbed, 85, 87, 91, 94. His heart rate dropped from 148 to 126 to 112 to stable. His eyes, which had been wide and animal with the knowledge of death approaching, focused. Clarity returned to them. He looked directly at Margaret, his chest heaving but breathing, and in that moment something passed between them that neither of them would ever speak about, a recognition older than words. The syringe hung from the needle hub, filled with the blood that had nearly killed him. Margaret held it steady, her hand as unchanging as a surgical laser, and counted the seconds it took for the monitor to settle into normal rhythms. 3 seconds. 4. 5. That was when Sterling walked into the room. He moved like a storm front arriving, his face already colored by rage before he fully processed what he was seeing. Margaret was still holding the syringe, still wearing the calm that had been forged in desert heat and enemy fire. Sterling's eyes flicked from her to the syringe to Reeves' improving vital signs to the ultrasound cart still positioned at the bedside, and something in his expression shifted from anger to something colder. Calculation. A man watching his plans fail in real time. "What did you do?" His voice was soft. That was worse than shouting. Soft was how men sounded when they were deciding your fate. Margaret didn't answer. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it, the catheter sliding out smoothly, and placed it on the sterile field. The syringe, evidence of procedure, proof of intervention, the physical manifestation of a direct violation of every chain of command in his hospital, she held up to the light, watching the blood catch the fluorescent glow. "You performed a pericardiocentesis," Sterling said, and it wasn't a question. His hands were clenched so hard his nails were drawing blood from his palms. Without physician authorization. Without credentials. Without, he stopped, and when he looked back at her, his eyes held something that looked almost like fear. Not fear of consequences. Fear of having underestimated someone he'd already decided was insignificant. "You're done here, Margaret. I'll have security remove you within the hour. Your license will be reported to the state board before breakfast. By noon, you'll be unemployable anywhere in California." He turned and left before Margaret could respond, his footsteps sharp on the tile, and Margaret thought about the 7 doctors who had refused this man. 7 skilled physicians who'd stood in Sterling's office and made the choice that resource allocation mattered more than a paralyzed veteran's spine. 7 doctors who had somewhere in them the seeds of men like Sterling, the learned habit of looking at human suffering and calculating its cost against their own risk. But that wasn't the worst part. Jennifer was staring at her with an expression Margaret had seen before, not gratitude. Recognition. The nurse was beginning to understand that the woman in front of her was not just a nurse. And that understanding, once seeded, could not be unplanted. Whatever came next would grow from this moment. Margaret could feel it the way she could feel atmospheric pressure changes in her bones. A storm was building. The only question was how far it would travel before it broke. Reeves' oxygen sat held steady at 96. His heart rate was 88. Normal. Stable. Alive. Margaret disposed of the needle in the sharps container and began documenting the procedure in his chart, her handwriting precise and clinical, no emotions, no drama, just facts. The facts would matter soon. But first, there would be consequences. First, there would be Sterling's phone calls. First, there would be the systematic disassembly of her presence in this hospital, brick by brick, until she had nothing left but a choice: disappear quietly, or stand and let the entire structure fall. Within the hour, Sterling's phone was already pressed to his ear, his voice smooth as oil through the line to Richard Corso, the board member he golfed with every Thursday at Torrey Pines. Corso listened for 47 seconds, then agreed without hesitation: an emergency disciplinary hearing could be arranged by end of business. Sterling hung up and immediately dialed a second number, one he'd called dozens of times over the past 5 years, Marcus Chen, the patient safety investigator he'd carefully cultivated with small favors, lunch invitations, and a subtle understanding that Sterling's influence extended further than Chen's career advancement. The allegations were prepared already, practicing outside her scope, performing a procedure without physician oversight, administering unmonitored interventions. Chen wrote them down without question. He would file them within the hour. By 11:08 a.m., Sterling made the third call, this one to a hospital in Phoenix where Margaret had supposedly worked 8 years prior. The administrator there, a woman Sterling had met once at a conference, accepted the characterization he fed her. Margaret Walsh had been terminated for incompetence, had falsified documentation, had put patients at risk. Sterling listened to her confirm the details back to him, voice like a tank idling in a garage, heavy and mechanical and impossible to stop once started. By noon, the machinery was in motion. Security arrived at Margaret's station with the kind of efficiency that suggested rehearsal, and she knew immediately that Sterling had already won. The guard, a young man named Davies who'd always nodded to her in the hallway, would not meet her eyes. Sterling himself appeared at 12:14 p.m., his presence making the corridor air pressure change, and he removed her badge with the theatrical precision of someone performing for an audience. The gesture was deliberate, badge in one hand, Margaret's termination letter in the other, read aloud to the nurses gathering at their stations like vultures sensing weakness. Practicing outside her scope. Performing an unauthorized invasive procedure. Patient endangerment. The words hung in the recycled hospital air, and Margaret listened to them as if they were someone else's accusations, directed at someone else's hands. Her hands. The ones that had saved James Reeves' life when 7 doctors had already decided he deserved to die. Sterling's eye searched her face for a crack, for trembling, for tears. He found none. Her jaw was steady. Her breathing remained even. She did not blink. When he finished reading, he held out the letter. Margaret took it from him, glanced at the official seal and the effective immediately clause, and tucked it into her scrub pocket without a word. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then a nurse coughed. Then another turned away. Margaret drove north through San Diego traffic, the afternoon sun pouring through the windshield of her Civic, her hand steady on the wheel though her throat was tight with a pressure that felt like drowning while remaining upright. She had lost her anonymity in one procedure. She had lost her employment in the time it took Sterling to read a lie aloud. She had lost her chance to repay the debt she'd carried since Sangin, the debt to a man whose life she'd saved while her own son had been breathing the same dust, walking the same compounds, carrying the same weight of command. The traffic on I-5 was slowing near the bridge, brake lights stretching out like a warning. She could have driven anywhere. She could have called David, though he didn't even know she was in San Diego, had no idea his mother had spent 3 years 1 floor away from the surgical wards where he'd trained before his commission. She could have called the Navy liaison office and let them handle Sterling. Instead, she turned left onto Nimitz Boulevard and drove toward Fort Rosecrans, where the ocean turned cold and the dead waited in neat rows. Section 20, Row G, Site 47. She found it by heart rather than the map, her feet remembering the path she'd walked 100 times in the rain and the wind. Thomas Walsh's grave marker was grey granite, darker at the edges where rain had pooled and moss had claimed the stone. Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. Beloved husband. Father. The rain had started while she was driving, soft at first, then with the kind of insistence that suggested it would last until sunset. Margaret knelt beside the grave, and the mud soaked through her scrubs at the knees, mud and cold water mixing with the thin fabric, her skin taking the temperature of the earth. Her hands pressed into the grass, and she could feel the rain on her shoulders, running down the back of her neck, accumulating in the hollow of her collarbones. Tom, she whispered, and the rain swallowed her voice. I had one job, keep David's commander alive, and I couldn't even do that without losing everything again. She stayed there, water streaming down her face, her jaw clenched so tightly she could feel her molars grinding. The graves around her were silent. The city beyond the cemetery walls was muted under the downpour, sound dampened as if the rain was pressing the world's volume lower and lower until only her breathing remained audible. She pressed her forehead against the wet stone, and for a moment, just a moment, the composure that had held her upright since Sterling read the termination letter began to fracture. Not tears. Something deeper. Something that felt like the ground beneath her was opening. She stood after what might have been 5 minutes or an hour, her knees unmarked by the impact they'd absorbed, and drove back through the rain toward the hospital she'd just been escorted out of. But Sterling was still there, still moving through the administrative corridors with the momentum of a man who believed himself unstoppable. At 7:04 p.m., he entered the IT office on the 3rd floor, where Marcus Webb, a former Marine corporal with a prosthetic left hand from the IED outside Kandahar that had also taken 3 of his friends, was backing up the hospital's patient records. Sterling's voice was low, conversational, the way someone speaks when they're certain of absolute compliance. I need the security footage from Reeves' room deleted, Sterling said, leaning against Marcus's desk. System glitch. It happens. Make it disappear. It wasn't a request. It was the tone of a man speaking to someone he'd already catalogued as powerless. Marcus looked up slowly. His right hand was flesh and bone. His left was titanium, carbon fiber, and $10,000 worth of prosthetic engineering that moved with the precision of a concert pianist. He'd kept his Marine bearing in the years since leaving service, posture still rigid, voice still steady, eyes still capable of reading the room the way he'd been trained to read terrain. "That's not procedure, Dr. Sterling," Marcus said quietly. Sterling straightened, and his hand moved to rest on the edge of the desk, a gesture meant to assert dominance. "You want to keep this job, Marcus?" The implication was crystalline. "Keep it by forgetting what you see. Keep it by becoming complicit." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll take care of it, sir." He watched Sterling leave, boots clicking away down the hallway. Then he copied every frame of security footage from the past 72 hours onto an encrypted external drive, footage of Margaret performing the pericardiocentesis with the precision of a surgeon, footage of Sterling witnessing it and making his threat, footage of Sterling entering the medication room at 3:14 a.m. 3 weeks earlier and altering the documentation with his own hands, replacing Margaret's accurate counts with inflated numbers, flagging non-existent supplies, billing for medications he'd never dispensed. All of it there. All of it recorded. All of it damning. At 9:52 p.m., Marcus sent an email to the FBI field office in San Diego with the subject line, "Healthcare Fraud Evidence, Sacred Heart Hospital." Then he waited. The rain continued through the night, and somewhere in the hospital, Sterling slept, unaware that he'd already been documented. Already been reported. Already been caught in the moment he decided that his career mattered more than a veteran's life. Margaret did not sleep. She sat in her apartment with the lights off, watching the rain streak down her windows, and waited for something she couldn't name, some signal from the military she'd left behind, some indication that the system that had trained her was paying attention. She had lost her job. She had lost her cover. She had saved a man's life and been fired for it. Everything she'd built in 3 years of invisibility had collapsed in 6 hours. The rain drummed against the glass. The city hummed beyond the darkness. And somewhere in the universe, the machinery of consequence was beginning to move. 0600. The rotor wash shook the entire eastern wing of Sacred Heart Hospital before anyone saw the aircraft. Fahums pulled into the emergency bay in perfect formation, tires squealing to synchronized stops. The lead vehicle's door opened and a man in digital camouflage stepped out, boots hitting pavement like punctuation marks. Behind him, 7 more Navy SEALs emerged, their movements precise as a surgeon's hands, each one moving with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators who had spent the last decade hunting in mountains that didn't forgive mistakes. They came through the sliding doors with the kind of authority that made the morning clerk's hand freeze above her keyboard. The SEAL team leader walked past the front desk without stopping, his presence making the air pressure change. His eye scanned the corridor with the cold calculation of someone accustomed to reading a room in 1.3 seconds. "Where is Senior Chief Walsh?" His voice wasn't loud. It was quieter than the fluorescent hum overhead, which made it exponentially more terrifying. It wasn't a request. It was a command that bent the hospital's physics around itself. In the second-floor administrative corridor, Dr. Sterling was reviewing discharge paperwork when his intercom buzzed. His secretary's voice trembled. "Doctor, there are military personnel in the building." Sterling didn't look up. His arrogance was a muscle he developed over 18 years of playing God in a lab coat. "Tell them visiting hours begin at 10. He didn't know that his entire constructed world was collapsing at the speed of sound. He didn't know that the machinery of consequence had shifted into overdrive at precisely 0600 hours. The SEAL team leader reached the 3rd floor. Behind him came David Walsh in dress blues so sharp they could draw blood, his uniform bearing the insignia of Lieutenant Commander, his jaw set with the kind of controlled fury that only comes from a son protecting a mother he'd thought was lost. The nurses scattered like startled birds. One dropped a medication tray. The sound of pills cascading across tile echoed down the hallway like a warning bell no one heeded. Dr. Sterling's office door swung open without a knock. David Walsh stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space like a weapon being drawn. Sterling looked up. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, one wearing the evidence of every corrupt decision he'd made, the other wearing the uniform of service that made Sterling's khaki coat look like a costume. David's voice, when it came, cracked with a pride and fury so complete it shattered something fundamental in the air between them. "You dismiss Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh." That was all he said. 8 words. 8 words that contained the weight of every classification, every commendation, every impossible decision made under fire in a place called Sangin where the mountains bled and the dust carried the taste of copper. The hospital administrator, Richard Barnes, appeared in the doorway behind David. His hands trembled as he held a folder, Margaret's actual personnel file, not the truncated version Sterling had been given. "Dr. Sterling," Barnes said, his voice barely steady, "I need you to hear this." He opened the folder. His eyes moved across the pages and something broke in his face. He began reading aloud. The nurses gathered in the hallway. Word spread like electricity through the building, through the break room, through the supply closets, through every corner where people stood stunned and motionless. The SEAL team leader stood silently beside David, his presence a physical thing, a promise and a threat wrapped in military bearing. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Eleanor Walsh," the administrator read, his voice gaining strength with each word. 23 years, 4 months of active service. 3 combat deployments. Medical training completed at Naval Medical Institute, Bethesda. Certification in emergency trauma surgery. Advanced pericardiocentesis training. Fluent in Dari. Fluent in Pashto. He paused, turning a page. Decorations for valor. Commendations for exceptional leadership. Recommended for. His voice faltered. Recommended for officer candidate school 3 times. Declined all 3 times to remain deployed. Sterling's face had gone the color of aged paper. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The SEAL team leader stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of a man who had trusted his life to the medical knowledge of the person Sterling had destroyed. 3 Navy Crosses. He paused, letting the weight settle. A Navy Cross was the military's second highest combat medal. 2 Silver Stars. Another pause. Longer this time. 8 Purple Hearts. And she saved more lives in Sangin than this entire hospital will see in a decade. His eyes never left Sterling's face. "I was one of them." The silence was so thick you could operate in it. An FBI agent stepped from behind the SEAL team. She was smaller than Sterling expected, which meant he'd already made his first mistake. She opened her credentials with the kind of casual authority that came from holding a warrant. "Dr. Sterling, I'm Special Agent Diana Diaz, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We've been investigating Medicare and insurance fraud connected to Sacred Heart Hospital for 6 months. Your medication discrepancy report filed by Senior Chief Walsh last week gave us the final piece." She held up a stack of printouts, each one stamped with federal case numbers. Invoices for surgical kits charged but never opened. Anesthesia billing for procedures performed under local sedation. Phantom equipment rentals for supplies that never left the warehouse. $847,000. Her voice remained conversational. Over 3 years. Sterling's lawyer had not yet arrived. In that moment, looking at the faces surrounding him, the son in uniform, the SEAL team leader with scars visible even under his camouflage, the FBI agent with printouts that spelled the complete architecture of his crimes, Sterling understood that his last mistake had been thinking a nurse was just a nurse. That a woman pushing a cart of supplies couldn't possibly be the reason his entire constructed empire was disintegrating in real time. The medication discrepancy report Margaret had filed. The one Sterling had used to justify her termination. The one he thought proved her incompetence. That single act of witnessing, her refusal to look away when the numbers didn't align, had been the thread that, when pulled, unraveled everything. Every fabricated invoice, every phantom supply order, every manipulation of billing codes that Sterling had convinced himself was too sophisticated to trace. Margaret had noticed it. Margaret had documented it. Margaret had done exactly what a person with integrity does when they encounter evidence of corruption. She had reported it. And Sterling had fired her for it. His hands began to shake. His lawyer would later advise him to remain silent. Sterling couldn't. This is about one nurse who didn't understand protocol. His voice cracked. Senior Chief Walsh understood protocol perfectly, Agent Diaz said. She understood it well enough to recognize when someone was violating it. Well enough to document it. Well enough to report it through proper channels. And well enough to save Commander Reeves's life when you refused to, using the same precision that kept 17 other operators alive in Sangin Valley. She closed her folder. You didn't fire her because she made a mistake, Dr. Sterling. You fired her because she witnessed your crime. The next hours unfolded like a collapse in real time. Sterling's hospital privileges suspended by noon. The State Medical Board notified within the hour. His attorney insisting he take a plea agreement rather than face federal charges. The hospital board convening in emergency session. Administrator Barnes making the announcement to the entire staff at 2 o'clock, Dr. Harrison Sterling's termination, effective immediately, pending criminal investigation. The nurses who had coordinated their silent rejection at lunch, who had stood and walked away without acknowledgement, they lined the back wall of that meeting room, unable to meet each other's eyes, understanding finally what they had participated in. At 1600 hours, Margaret was still at Fort Rosecrans Cemetery, kneeling beside her husband's grave in the rain, when David found her. He sat down without ceremony, his dress uniform soaking through, and he didn't speak at first. Just sat beside her the way a son sits beside a mother when words are a secondary language to presence. They want you to come back, David finally said. The hospital board. They're offering reinstatement with back pay. The nurses. He paused. The whole unit stood and clapped when they found out who you were. Every single person except the ones who walked away. Margaret didn't move. I can't go back, David. I left that life because it broke me. Because I couldn't stop seeing Sangin every time I closed my eyes. Because your father's grave is the only place that makes sense anymore. David knelt beside her. He was still in uniform, mud soaking into his dress blues. You saved Commander Reeves. You exposed a fraud worth nearly $1 million. You didn't break, Mom. You bent, and then you stood back up. His voice was steady, the way a son's voice becomes when he understands finally that his mother isn't what he thought she was. Isn't less. Is infinitely more. You don't have to be the person you were in Sangin. Just be the nurse who does the right thing. That's all you've ever been. Margaret looked at her son, seeing Tom's eyes in his face, and something shifted. Not back. Forward. At 1630 hours, Margaret walked back into Sacred Heart Hospital in her scrubs, her badge clipped to her pocket, her hands steady as they had always been. The nurses in the hallway stopped their work. One began to clap. Then another. The applause built until the entire unit was standing, a tide of recognition that crashed through the corridor and kept moving, kept growing, until it reached every corner of the hospital that had witnessed Sterling's betrayal and Margaret's betrayal only minutes before. The truth didn't just silence the room. It brought the hospital to its knees, but in the way that only redemption can, not in defeat, but in the recognition of a wrong finally corrected. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because these stories aren't over. Comment below, if you were David, how long would you have waited before sending the military to correct this injustice? And follow us for the final reckoning, where we'll show you exactly what happened to Dr. Sterling in the 6 months after Sacred Heart Hospital said no to corruption. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.